Okay, so here's our Turbo History Streamcast. It's going to get you caught up to the Reconstruction. This is basically going to serve as our review for up till then. So we start with our colonial heritage. We were discovered because Europe wanted to explore and find more trade routes to get through Asia. One of the most famous ones was Christopher Columbus in 1492, who thought he discovered Asia, but he really didn't. He landed somewhere in the Bahamas and ended up discovering America. This led to a huge slew of explorers coming. For example, the Spanish conquistadors, who actually conquered the Aztecs and started to form Mexico and those countries down there, which led to France coming, Netherlands came, which are the Dutch, Sweden came, and most importantly, England, who colonized. So there were three basic areas of colonies. The South was basically your farming, and that was Virginia, Georgia, North and South Carolina. They still grow quite a bit of crops now. Then we have New England, which was Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. And the people who settled here basically wanted religious freedom. They were called Puritans, and they were being persecuted in Europe, so they came over to practice freely. And the middle colonies were a combination of both. They both served as trade centers. They had cities just like New England did, and they grew crops just like the South did. So the colonies were New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And these formed the original 13 colonies. And so a lot of things led up to the American Revolution, and that's kind of where we're going to go now. So, Turbo, the Great Awakening, which is where the spread of new ideas and new theories. The French and Indian War, which is where things started to go south for the colonies in Britain. But the British actually won the war, so it allowed the settlers to move west. If you remember, we talked about that line where they couldn't cross, where the Native Americans were. That allowed them to move this line. And this became the start of the taxes and the start of the resentment for the king, who kept adding taxes on this and onto that. You had the Townshend Acts, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and they basically used it to pay for the French and Indian War. And this ends up starting the Revolutionary War, with notable events such as the Boston Tea Party, where a lot of tea was thrown into the water, and the Boston Massacre, which pretty much sparked a war. So then we have the American Revolution, and we have the two Continental Congresses. The first Continental Congress, where they talked about preparing for the war, and the second Continental Congress, where they put George Washington in charge of the Patriot Army. What also came out of this was the Declaration of Independence. So, long story short, the Patriots win, based on the fact that they knew the land better than the British did, and they gained allies such as Spain, who would help them to defeat the British. So around the Second Continental Congress time, the Articles of Confederation were written, which formed a weak Congress, much like the one we have today. They put in trade laws, which were unfair at the time and caused taxes. People did not like them, of course, because taxing was not the best for the colonies at the time, since British were doing that as well. And then there was Shays' Rebellion, which basically told them that their government was not strong enough and needed to be stronger, which leads to the Constitutional Convention, where the Constitution gets formed, puts in three branches of government, and the checks and balance system to keep each branch, legislative, executive, and judicial, from gaining too much power. So our first president was George Washington, and he stressed neutrality with foreign events. He had a lot of foreign policy issues that came up. He actually created the first cabinet, and two of his cabinet members were Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. They often disagreed, and this is where the two parties, Republican and Democratic, took shape and began to form. Then we get to the age of Jackson. So we're fast forwarding a whole bunch of years, and we start hearing about suffrage, which is the right to vote. That should be a T there. And we get the beginning of disagreements between the North and the South, and we hear of this manifest destiny, which means we are continuing to move the Native Americans further and further west, and this was the belief that Americans had the fate of settling as far west as possible. And Texas was a huge deal here. This was the Mexican-American War. We fought over the land that was Texas. Remember the Alamo, all that good stuff. So basically we start seeing the North become more industrial with the age of steam and the growth of cities, and the South become more agricultural with the cotton boom, and they had slaves. At this point, the North and the South were starting to disagree on the slave thing. So the North, kind of were working toward freeing the slaves, while the South wanted to keep them. And this leads us to abolitionism. So abolitionism was a movement against the slavery laws. We also had the Second Great Awakening, which focused a little bit on alcohol and the dangers of it, and would eventually lead to prohibition. We'll talk about that later in the year. And basically we had suffrage, where the women also tried to gain the right to vote. All of this is leading to a division. So the nation has now become divided into slave and free states. There were a lot of failed compromises or agreements. There was a fear of there would be an unequal balance between slave and free states. That's when they started colonizing California and Oregon, and they couldn't decide whether they would be slave or free states. The South wanted them to be slaves. North wanted them to be free. We had the Dred Scott case, which basically was one of the igniters of the Civil War. And as a result of the Dred Scott case, South states decided to leave the Union when Lincoln was elected. And lo and behold, we get to the Civil War. And that's pretty much Turbo history in a nutshell.